The fight for socialism is the most colossal civil war world history has seen. Civil war indeed. The First World War ended and the socialists immediately began to fight over the remains of the German Reich. Actually, the squabbles had already started when the war was still going on. In 1916-17, when the specter of war blotted Europe, the Social Democrats experienced a split. The socialist main faction embraced the war effort against the will of the minority in the party. This resulted in two parties, which called itself Unabhängige Sozialdemokratische Partei, which means Independent Social Democratic Party, while the majority called itself Mehrheitssozialdemokratische Partei, which means Majority Social Democratic Party of Germany, although they reverted to their old name SPD in 1922. The parallels to the Soviet Mensheviks and Bolsheviks are astounding. It is no overstatement to say that the Weimar Republic was a creation of majority socialists, the SPD. With the November Revolution, they had seized control over Germany and ousted the monarch and his war cabinet. From a party barred from leadership positions, it became the by far biggest party in Germany. Its influence went so far that the other parties could be characterized by their attitude towards the rising socialists. This brought up the question where they would take the new socialist Germany. While the SPD would determine the structure of the new Weimar Republic, this was not clear from the start. The first enemy came from within. The most famous members of the USPD were Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They spent the war imprisoned, but when Liebknecht was released in October 1918, he climbed the royal balcony at the Imperial Palace and declared that the German Revolution would follow the Soviet style. This was against the SPD's own agenda. Still, the first Republican government was one of SPD and USPD. Each party sent 3 members. This fragile alliance held until December of 1918, around 1 month. All over Germany, councils had sprung up, and a majority of them supported the more moderate SPD. Finding themselves in a losing position, the USPD left the government even before the first election. On Christmas Eve 1918, the first artillery shots were fired in Berlin, and in January of the next year, a full-blown uprising by the Spartakists, a communist group close to the USPD, followed. The SPD decided to use the full power of the state's forces as well as the support of right-wing Freikorps and crushed their former comrades mercilessly. Luxemburg and Liebknecht paid with their lives for this insurrection. When the names Luxemburg and Liebknecht come up, it usually is in a whiny tone, lamenting their murder. Which technically is not wrong, but you know how it goes. F around and find out. To be honest, after reading the violent and dictatorial program of the Spartakists, I have no sympathy whatsoever left for Luxemburg and Liebknecht, although it seems like they were the wing of the communists who hesitated to call for violence. We will have a look at the program soon. You can tell me in the comments what you think about it. Berlin was not the only place where the Bolshevik forces attempted a revolution. Munich was another important city where radical socialists took control. After toppling the Bavarian king, Ludwig III, the USPD politician Kurt Eisner was in charge. However, in the Bavarian elections of 1919, he won only 3 seats, while both the Social Democrats and the local Conservative Party won more than 50 each. It took Eisner weeks to accept this outcome. On his way to his speech of resignation, he was fatally shot by an anti-revolutionary. Violence ensued, and the Bavarian Council's Republic was formed. Only weeks after putting down the Spartakists in Berlin, the SPD sent armed forces. They crushed the Bolsheviks in Bavaria too. Violence against innocents occurred on both sides. These attempts of revolution were not without consequence. The communist forces in Germany had shown their true colors. Around 100,000 Hungarians fleeing revolutionary fights in their home country had already reached Vienna and told their stories. German volunteers had fought the Soviets in the Baltics. Such experiences found their counterpart in rumors about atrocities in Bolshevik Russia, which in hindsight seem very believable, as well as stories about Russian POWs taking up arms and even Russian Bolshevik armies marching west. This left a lasting impression. Communism was a threat. Even the SPD realized that, as the communists' intentions were detailed in their political program. Since they were the most radical of the socialist parties, we will start with the Spartakists. Their call for the socialist revolution in 1919 begins as follows. Not where the wage slave sits next to the capitalist, where the rural proletarian sits next to the nobleman in hypocritical equality, to debate the life questions parliamentary, but where the million-headed proletariat seizes the entire state power with his calloused fist to smash it like the god Thor his hammer against the head of the ruling classes. There alone is democracy that is not a deception of the people. Such did the communists justify their opposition to the new republic. After these motivational words, it is rather unsurprising that the Spartakists' first points are all about seizing guns and ammunition from the police, officers and the enemy class in general, and redistributing them to the proletarian worker militia, which they would like to call the Red Guard. Of course, all foodstuff would be seized to ensure that the population is fed. The Spartakists imagined the Red Guard as follows. They should not be based on cadaver-like obedience, but on the voluntary discipline of the soldiers, who would vote for their commanders. The military tribunals would lose their authority, and revolutionary tribunals would take their place to judge and condemn those responsible for the war, as well as counter-revolutionary forces. This especially included the Hohenzollern, Ludendorff, Hindenburg, Tirpitz, and their fellow criminals. The communists would build their own state by doing away with Germany's federative structure and put a centralized socialist republic in its place. Then, workers' and soldiers' councils, elected by the male and female population, would take the place of all political assemblies. From these councils, delegates would be elected and sent to a central council with legislative as well as executive powers. All class differences, including medals and titles, would be abolished. Legally and socially, the sexes should be equal. The Spartakists also called for comprehensive social reforms, like shortening the labor day to 6 hours, maybe even less to account for unemployment. Additionally, food, housing, health and education policies would be fashioned according to the proletarian revolution. Regarding economics, the communists would seize all dynastic as well as other sizable assets. They would also disown estates in order to build up cooperatives. Small farmers may stay independent until they voluntarily join the cooperatives. I should point out here that it says until, not unless, which from my point of view implies some pressure. Needless to say, banks, mines, foundries, transportation, as well as major industrial and commercial enterprises would be seized by the state. When it comes to foreign policy, the communists would immediately make contact with their brothers in other countries, with the aim of an international revolution, all under the objective of achieving peace, obviously. For the rest of the 1.5 pages of the 4-page program, the Spartakist League lists their enemies, especially the Social Democrats, and describes how they unfairly denounce them and are traitors to the revolution. At the end of the program, the Spartakists direct a threat against the enemies. Thumbs on the eye and knees on the chest, which I interpret as the threat to gouge out their enemies' eyes and suffocate them. The ideas of the Spartacus League translate to the USPD's program. There is no use in repeating the Spartakists' ideas. Instead, let's only mention the changes in the program. In general, they also advocate for the disarmament of the bourgeoisie and the nationalization of nearly everything. In contrast to the Spartakists, they explicitly list where the planned economy would apply. Hint, nearly everywhere. They also want to make work obligatory. On foreign policy, they demand alliances with friendly revolutionary countries, especially in the framework of the Socialist International, in order to advance the worldwide revolution. All in all, the USPD's program has roughly the same content as the Spartakists. It is noticeable how they try to avoid using direct calls to violence. Instead, they imply this in the program. Here's an obvious example. The independent social democracy rejects violent actions by individual groups and individuals. The goal is not the destruction of means of production, but the elimination of the capitalist system. This means individual violence, bad. Class violence, good. And then we have the Communist Party's program. In the first paragraph, they declare that the program is the opposition to the Nazis' demagogy. This is very interesting, since the Communists published the program shortly before the election of 1930, in which the Nazis became a relevant power. They must have already feared to lose voters to them. It is ironic that in the very next sentence they state that they reject the Treaty of Versailles as well as the Young Plan, just like the Nazis did. They call the Nazis hypocrites frequently, just like they do with the SPD. In opposition to the Nazis or not, economically few things changed from their predecessors. They intend to double the capitalists and big landowners. Of course, the means of production must be seized. The state's debt will be voided. Work must be obligatory. The communists want a 4-day working week with 7 hours a day, which makes the work week with 28 hours even shorter than the Spartakist suggestion of 30 hours. Prices will be set according to the social class of the buyer. So much about equality. In general, the program is full of accusations and sounds very aggressive. The foreign policy can be described shortly: bind Soviet Germany to Soviet Russia and make the world tremble. In short, the KPD was the Soviet Union's arm in Germany, as Neumann tells us. The KPD itself is absolutely loyal to the political and ideological line of Moscow's dictations, like Vertucci is duty-bound by the statute of the Third International. Hereby determines its changing slogans by the tactical positions of Russia, through which these actions support Russian foreign policy at best. And now to the SPD's program, the biggest socialist party and nothing less than the creator of Weimar Germany. The Social Democratic Party of Germany is the party of the working people in both urban and rural areas. It aims to unite all physically and mentally productive individuals who rely on the fruits of their own labor, fostering shared understanding and goals. The SPD stands as a fighting force for democracy and socialism. So starts the SPD's program and continues for 2 of 5 pages with a description of how they see the current state of the world and what happened during the Great War. On domestic issues, the SPD calls for a multitude of labor laws and social welfare. They also want to consolidate the republic under a centralized state, although some federative aspects are allowed. All state institutions should be democratized, whatever that means. Interestingly, the Social Democrats want to replace private law with social law, by which they mean subordinating the rights of the individual under the rights of the community. The national community should have the supreme right on the education of the people. Nevertheless, the schools as well as the parents should have some autonomy. On economic issues, the Social Democrats demand that the government take control of large portions of the economy. They call this to withdraw from capitalist control and transfer to the national community. They want to successively enhance this control, but do not call for the outright expropriation of all private property. Instead, they want an extensive program of taxes on income, assets and inheritance, as well as the participation of the public in the asset of capitalist enterprises. It seems like this program is intentionally designed to bring around the nationalization of private property step by step. Foreign policy should ensure peace by international cooperation of the working class on the basis of democracy in the League of Nations. The League of Nations should also press for disarmament and take control of all colonies. The Treaty of Versailles should be revised. When we try to put Spartakists, USPD and KPD into a modern perspective, the answer is clear. They are die-hard Marxists, ready for violence and collectivist to the core. While in the beginning they stood on their own, later they were just a marketing agency of Soviet Russia. It is hard to find a modern-day equivalent. At least, no one would be willing to say such a thing openly, using the same tone, although there are some figures in the SPD, the Greens and the Linke who propose similar economic policies while trying their best to use friendly-sounding words. The Social Democrats are, well, Social Democrats, although from a modern perspective they are pretty radical Marxists too, although not on the scale of the communist parties. The SPD during the times of Weimar tried not to talk explicitly about their wishes for outright nationalization. This issue is even more subordinated today. I had a quick look into the program of the local Social Democrats. The difference is that today they talk much more about specific wishes for government-run welfare programs instead of big dreams of how to recreate society. This is probably because all the social programs this party once called for exist today at a level they could not even have imagined. In today's Germany, the party closest to any of the Weimar socialists probably is Die Linke, the left, heirs to the SED of East Germany. Now we should find out where the members and voters of the socialist parties came from. Even when the SPD did not participate in government, it still upheld the Republic. Thereby, they gained a relatively diverse voter base. Estimates from around 1930 put the portion of workers who voted for the Social Democrats as high as 25 to 40%, while there were 60% workers in the voting population at most. Many of those were unionized. It is symptomatic that the call to vote by the ideological elite of the SPD for the election of 1930 was almost entirely signed by scientists, while practically exclusively artists advocated for the communists in a corresponding declaration. This quote puts the finger on the wound. The SPD was a creation of intellectuals. Over time, the SPD became a party of bigwigs and fat cats. This made it hard to gain younger voters, who rather went to the KPD or the NSDAP. What made the SPD so powerful, independent of its results in the elections, was a stringent organization. This allowed it to gather political power, be it geographically, institutionally, or in regard to political issues. This strength also was its worst enemy. At some point, the organization will cease to be the instrument and become the purpose in itself. In contrast, the KPD was a little bit stronger with the working class. Although founded by qualified workers and intellectuals, they were younger and a larger number of the members were industrial workers without higher education. Especially after 1931, the communists became the party of the unemployed, with only 11% of the members having a job. Many of the electorate were inhabitants of old tenements in the cities. In short, voters came to the KPD out of class consciousness. The party lived off multiple crises in the Weimar Republic and drew the anti-parliamentarian voters from the SPD. With all their differences established, the socialist parties headed into the first election of the new republic. These happened shortly after the revolts and showed whom the population preferred. The SPD got 37.9%. The USPD got another 7.6%. Their combined ideological bloc had an enormous 45.5% of the vote. With Ebert, Scheidemann, Bauer and Müller, the SPD had 4 chancellors until June 1920. Each stayed in office for only some months. First president of the Reich, although not elected, became the SPD politician Ebert. These men gave birth to Weimar under the mess of left-wing revolts. But the left was not the only source of chaos. In 1920, under the patronage of former Marshal Ludendorff, a military conspiracy aimed at creating an authoritarian state by toppling the acting government. Followed by a direct election of the president, preferable Hindenburg, this might have led to the recreation of the monarchy. Wolfgang Kapp would become the new chancellor, which is why the coup attempt is called the Kapp Putsch. Parts of the socialist cabinet left Berlin for Dresden. Others stayed. The military got control of the governmental district in Berlin. Nevertheless, the coup attempt was not successful. The SPD government ordered a general strike. Most military support came from East Germany, but there the workers armed themselves, thereby binding military forces. Other political parties were unwilling to join in support of Kapp, and his coup attempt failed. Another election followed in 1920. When the SPD had fought the Bolsheviks, they triumphed in the elections. Now they had fought the right-wing putsch and had to rely on the support of the extreme left. They lost big, crushing to 21.7%. The USPD reached near parity with the SPD. From now on, the SPD was out of the cabinet, and the Centrum and the Liberal parties would be the core of all future governments. In 1922, the German government concluded the Treaty of Rapallo, which aligned Germany more with the Soviet Union. It had enormous impact on the socialists in Germany. Of course, the communists were enthusiastic about the alignment with the Soviets. The SPD was unsure if it was wise to anger the Western powers, but the German president Ebert from the SPD accepted the treaty since he saw it as the right of the government to commit to such a contract. The USPD took a similar stance. Then Walter Rathenau, the liberal foreign minister who had negotiated the treaty and insisted that all problems could be solved by simply printing money, was murdered by nationalists. The government, including the SPD, decided to push a law for the protection of the Republic, but needed the votes of the USPD to change the constitution. The SPD moved to the left and re-embraced the former Spartakists. To be fair, the USPD had moved to the right after the split in 1920 over the issue of uniting with the KPD, to which they had lost a lot of members. Both parties reunited in 1922. For a short time it seemed like the SPD and the KPD could actually cooperate. In Saxony they came to an understanding, and it seemed like the same thing would happen in Thuringia. A devastating event, brought about by the Treaty of Rapallo, would prevent this. French and Belgian troops occupied the Rhineland in January of 1923. Long story short, the German government called for strikes against the occupiers and printed large amounts of banknotes to finance those. What happens when one increases the quantity of money? Right, inflation. In this case, even hyperinflation. The SPD joined the government of national unity during this time. Since the government called for strikes, the socialists, with their natural proximity to the unions, played an important role. For the communists, the strikes and the desperate economic situation were most inspiring. Although usually following an internationalist ideology, a nationalist wing arose, known as the National Bolsheviks. This was the flag. What does it remind me of? I cannot put my finger on it. For the Soviet communists, the terrible situation in Germany was analogous to the circumstances which had led to the revolution in Russia in 1917. They basically ordered the German KPD to attempt a coup. Unsurprisingly, they picked the month of October, but the whole issue proved to be a non-starter. Some workers rose in Hamburg, but without the support of the population, they were immediately crushed. The military moved into Saxony and Thuringia and ended the attempt for a socialist alliance for good. Out of protest, the SPD left the coalition. The KPD was outlawed. That is, outlawed only until right before the next election in May 1924. Although the USPD had all but dissolved, this did not benefit the SPD. Reunited, they got only 20.5%, while the communists exploded to 12.6%. And yes, there is a good chance that a considerable number of former SPD voters tried their luck with the newly founded Nazi Party. The occupation of the Ruhr would end in 1925. The Dawes Plan, signed after the election, would regulate German reparations. The SPD favored this agreement, while the communists, together with the International Brothers, condemned it. However, in the new parliament, majorities were hardly possible. A second election was held in December. It seems the stabilization benefited the SPD, which rose to 26%, while the KPD retreated to 9%. In general, the more extreme parties lost and voters returned to their original allegiances, thanks to improving economic conditions. As so often, the Centrum and the Liberals came together to form the government. In the presidential election of 1925, the SPD's candidate Otto Braun got 29% and the communist Ernst Thälmann 7%, both pulling approximately the same amount of votes as their respective parties. In the runoff, Otto Braun dropped out. The SPD supported the Zentrum candidate Marx, who seemed to have better chances against former General Field Marshal Hindenburg, who had been dragged out of retirement by a coalition of nationalists. The communist Thälmann decided to stay in the race, thereby handing Hindenburg the majority. The SPD would remain on the sidelines until 1928. In this election, the SPD reached nearly 30% and suddenly was back in government. The KPD won slightly too. A big point of discussion was the building of the new Panzerkreuzer A ship type, the later Deutschland class heavy cruiser, which both socialist parties opposed with the slogan "Children's meals instead of armored cruisers." Spoiler alert, after the election, the SPD would support building this new warship. Hermann Müller, who had been Chancellor in 1920 for less than 3 months, became Chancellor again with a cabinet of SPD, DDP, DVB and Zentrum and BVB respectively. This cabinet remained in place until March 1930. During Müller's second term, the Young Plan was signed in June 1929. This treaty stretched reparations over decades and removed foreign rights on financial inspections. Additionally, the French would leave the Rhine area for good. This treaty was also the basis for 20 years of German reparation payments from 1990 onwards. The communists reacted to the government led by their ideological comrades with becoming more extreme, maybe fearing that they could have success. Soviet influence played a role as well. Stalin had no interest in peace between Germany and France. The communists used a proven method, called the SPD social fascists, and had some success with this instrument when after communist and Nazi clashes, Russia forbade the Nazis SA as well as the KPD's Roter Front-Kämpferbund, an alliance of Red Front fighters, as well as their gatherings. With 1930 arose the question of how to handle the Great Depression, which had emerged since October 1929. The coalition of Zentrum SPD, DDP, DVB and BVP were close to finding a compromise to balance the budget. It included keeping a tax on industry earlier intended for reparations, increasing workers' insurance fees and cutting benefits. Alas, it failed and the SPD's ministers left the cabinet, although they agreed not to vote against the government. The president of the Reichsbank, Schacht, resigned over this too and was replaced by the former Chancellor Luther, a liberal. A new election was held in 1930, in which everyone lost votes, except for the communists and the Nazis, who literally exploded and became the second largest party behind the SPD only. After the election of 1930, a majority without Hitler was only possible if the SPD would join the government. Zentrum Chancellor Brüning held talks with the former SPD Chancellor Müller, but they came to no conclusion, probably on account of both sides. No SPD ministers would join the cabinet, but the SPD would tolerate Brüning's government, simply because they wanted to prevent the Nazis from gaining positions in power. Additionally, the Social Democrats hoped that the coalition of right-wingers would, or at least be seen, as responsible for running down the economy, and thereby bringing closer the final revolution. By doing so, the SPD supported the existing republican but also capitalist structures, which they actually wanted to abolish. Needless to say, the voters were not entirely happy about this. In July 1932, the SPD lost additional votes, while the KPD continued its upward trend, and the Nazis doubled, thereby becoming the largest party in Germany by a wide margin. Toleration without participation immobilized the SPD politically. The policy of tolerating a conservative liberal government was also due to the fact that the SPD had its own power base in Prussia through a coalition with the Zentrum. In 1932, foreshadowing what was to come, the SPD lost Prussia. After an election in April, Prussia, just like the Reich, was left without possible majorities. The old and stable coalition of SPD, Zentrum and Liberals had too few votes, and neither SPD nor Zentrum were willing to create a coalition with the NSDAP. Just like the Nazis did with the SA, the Socialists also created their own organization of thugs. Out of the Veterans Association called Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, which came out of SPD, Zentrum and Liberals, the SPD founded the Schutzformationen, protection formations, which probably reached around 250,000 members in 1932. Later it would become the Eiserne Front, Iron Front. The Communists did the same and created the Roter Frontkämpferbund, which means Alliance of Red Front Fighters. The recruits were drawn from a more general communist organization, which was named, guess what? Correct, Antifa, the Antifaschistische Aktion, Anti-Fascist Action. These organizations violently clashed with the National Socialists SA, especially in Prussia. These fights would bring about the first step in the SPD's demise, when they lost control over their most important political power base. In July, after heavy fighting, General Schleicher, Minister of the Armed Forces, became ruler of Prussia by Hindenburg's edicts, thereby basically staging a coup d'etat. The nationalists used the situation to replace civil servants with their own party members. The SPD, as well as the Iron Front and the unions, passively observed their own demise. Each faction in the party hesitated, and in the end, no one was able to seriously push for coordinated resistance like a strike. In November, the next election followed. The NSDAP lost some votes, but the SPD could not benefit. Instead, they lost again, while the Communists got to third place and dangerously close to the Social Democrats. This was not a surprise. We might expect parties which are ideologically close to cooperate, but the Communists' primary strategy was to unite the workers in a Einheitsfront, a front of unity. That is, a front under their command, naturally. This made the SPD one of the preferred targets to attack politically. The Communists saw the SPD, their bigger brother, as the primary barrier on the way to the revolution. Taking into account how the SPD had crushed their violent rebellions, they were not wrong. Say what you will about the Socialists, they were not naive and knew that the National Socialist totalitarian regime was coming. When Hitler became Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, the party began to create hidden meeting places and print media. Additionally, they more and more turned the Veterans Association, the Reichsbanner, into a paramilitary group and at least tried to arm them. The KPD had already stormed far ahead. On a regular basis, they clashed bloodily with the Nazis. The strategy altered between calling for a general strike together with the SPD on the one day and calling the Social Democrats fascist on the other. All thoughts of resistance soon proved to be in vain. In February 1933, many Social Democrats expected a final decision in the form of a civil war. The burning of the Reichstag on the night of the 27th to the 28th of February put a stop to any momentum that might have existed. The following decrees gave the Nazis all the power they needed to suppress opposition forces. Primary target was the KPD, although many of its members successfully went into hiding or left the Reich. In the following, not entirely free and fair election of the 5th of March 1933, every party got crushed, especially the Social Democrats and the Communists. Both of them had been the primary targets of the Nazis' attempts to suppress enemy parties. The SPD sank to 18.3% and the Communists lost a quarter of the voter share and ended with 12.3%. The Nazis got only 43.9%, but since most Communists were imprisoned or had already fled and therefore could not join sessions in parliament, they now held an absolute majority. Because of this, the following vote in the Reichstag on the Enabling Act was only show. No Communists were present. We might count this as a no vote, but technically they did not vote at all. Of the 120 SPD members of parliament, only 94 were present. All of these voted against Hitler in opposition to all the other parties. The others shared the fate of the communists. Give credit where credit is due. They knew what had happened to their comrades. SA members were present and chanting. Still, they decided to show open resistance. When the act had been passed, it was clear that the time of political parties was over. The members of the SPD had to make a decision: either shift the activities into illegality or join the Nazis. It seems that the second option was the preferred one. The SPD's underground network survived until 1935 only, not because it was uncovered, but simply because of a lack of funds, which tells us about its popularity. What might have hurt the hardest was the loss of the unions. Shortly after the last election, the Union's board declared its loyalty to Hitler. Of course, this happened under pressure, but in the end it made no difference. In May, the party decided to send some members out of the country to create a party in exile in Prague. This immediately led to conflicts about who was in charge. In the end, the squabbles were of no importance. On the 22nd of June 1933, the SPD became illegal. When looking at the ideological groups in Weimar Germany, a pattern emerges. There always is one party supporting the Republic while another is against it. In the case of the conservatives and the liberals, this meant that they advocated for a return to monarchy. Among the socialists, the political aims were not so different. The distinction was that the SPD stood for Realpolitik and therefore preferred representative parliamentarism and democratic revolution, while the KPD was truly revolutionary. The communists opposed the Republic on the grounds that they preferred a Soviet-style state to reach true socialism and true democracy. Although being the majority party, the SPD could only take a supporting role by implementing tactical coalitions with the conservatives and the liberals. This does not mean that it did not leave a major imprint on the history of Germany. The SPD created the democratic Germany with all its merits and faults. The party exists to this day, although already in the political program of 1945 they had decidedly become less extreme Marxists. To be fully transparent, I'm not particularly fond of socialism, and this is an understatement. Still, I hope I manage to approach this topic as fair as possible and manage to restrain my urge to comment, especially my sarcasm. We'll meet again in some weeks and talk about the conservatives in Weimar Germany. Until then, stay critical, stay curious, stay free.